Welcome to Virtual Balticon 54. The panelist we are hosting at this point in time is Life on a Little Known Planet, the Ant, the Update, hosted by John LaPala. We will be beginning our session in approximately 30 seconds. John, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone, and I'm going to share my screen now to start the presentation. So I have actually slightly different title than showed up in the program. I'm actually going to talk today about crazy ants and sort of get into what that is. So one of the things that we myrmecologists, those who study ants, like to think about is how we sort of consider the current time that we live in. And some of you may know that nowadays scientists often talk about this being the age of the so-called Anthropocene, meaning that sort of period of human domination that we have now with effects of climate change and habitat loss and all the various ways that people have affected the biosphere. But we myrmecologists like to talk about this rather in terms of being the Myrmicoscene. And I'm actually having trouble with my animation there. Let's see what's happening here. Oh, there we go. All right. We like to talk about this being called the Myrmicoscene, or the period of time being dominated by the ants. And in fact, ants have really dominated the terrestrial world for probably the last 30 to 40 million years. And here are just some of the nice little faces of happy little ants that we can see around the globe. So there are more than just black and red ants, despite popular opinion. And this is just giving you some of the broad biodiversity that we have out there that we can see. So one of the things that's interesting to note is, again, there are more than just black and red ants, as people tell me. There's actually currently about nearly 14,000 described species of ants around the world. And that's just described species. This map here is showing you sort of estimates of numbers of species by different countries around the globe. And you'll notice, of course, that, well, I should say, as the color gets sort of darker red, as you see in here, that's showing increasing number of species in each of those places. And you'll notice that the diversity of ants, as it does in many groups of organisms, really peaks around the tropics. So you'll notice right around the equators where we get sort of those deep red colors. It's worth noting that there are presently about 14,000 described ant species, but we myrmecologists estimate that that's probably about half of all the known diversity. So we estimate there's probably somewhere truly around 20 to 30,000 species out there. And in today's presentation, I'll give you some data to sort of show why we think that, in terms of just one group, the crazy ants in particular, that I'm going to talk about. So this is actually a map showing, not a map of ants, but this is actually a map showing shipping routes and the intensity by which ships travel across the ocean to various ports around the world. And so the intensity of the red just showing you the amount of travel that's taking place. And you might wonder, well, how does this relate to sort of thinking about things like ants? So again, I sort of started talking about this idea that we might be in the Anthropocene, right, the human-dominated era. And here you can see, certainly we're crossing the oceans many, many times as global trade takes place. But it's important to keep in mind that when we humans travel across on a big cargo ship across the ocean, it's not necessarily just the cargo that's traveling along with us. Oftentimes there's lots of other things, lots of other critters that are traveling along with us. And one of those critters that often travels along are ants. And so in a recent study that came out just a few years back, they found that there were just over 230 ant species that move along these trade routes. And in other words, they sort of get onto cargo ships and travel along. There are a variety of ways ants can do that. Some of it will be that they'll travel in, if there's soil, the ants may travel, the ant colony may travel in that nest inadvertently. They may get into various products, the sort of that they may crawl into and establish a colony. There's a variety of ways that can happen. But one thing to point out is that when you sort of look at port of entries and you talk to port inspectors and things, they commonly find ants. And there are about 230 species that regularly move along these routes. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that as I said, there are about 14,000 known ant species, but only a relatively small subset of those actually move around with people. But the ones that do have a big economic and ecological effect. So we can actually look at this. This is taking data from that 2017 study. This is taking reports of ants from about the mid-19th century to the present. And this is sort of looking at the numbers of countries that an ant has been moved from. So what this is saying is it's talking about it going from when their native location, so where they're originally from, and as they sort of get moved to a different location around the globe. So this graph is pointing those out here. And some of these I'll sort of mention in a moment. This is just sort of highlighting some of the most widespread. These are species that have moved to dozens, in some cases over 100 different countries around the globe. So here's sort of a list of those most widespread species that we can talk about. Some of these ants that get moved around become very important both economically and ecologically. And these are going to be species that we're going to call invasive. And this term invasive is a bit of a squishy term that we use, but it's really referring to any species that's being spread outside of its native range to another location and causing economic and or ecological problems in the newly established place that it's gotten to. And among the ants, again, this is only a very small subset of all 14,000 known species, but the ones that have spread around and become invasive really do pack quite an economic and ecological punch. And so the 5 species I have up here are 5 of the sort of most problematic invasive ants. Many of you have, I'm sure, heard of, maybe even experienced things like the red imported fire ant, which is across the American South. But there are a number of species out there. Something like the red imported fire ant affects both agricultural interest in terms of the ability to farm certain fields and have livestock and those kinds of things, and also affects human health, right? It can be difficult to just go outside your house and mow your lawn or something if there's a bunch of fire ant nests and things like that. So some of these are these globally invasive species that we can talk about. Okay, and just waiting for my next slide. All right, don't seem to be able to move the slides right here.
John, do you need a moment?
Yeah, I'm somehow here. Sorry, folks, I'm having some technical, my computer seems to have been frozen. So the wonders of doing things on the internet here. Yes, Hannah, I'm not sure if I can't seem to get my screen unfrozen. I'm not sure why here. Let me see. Yeah, I cannot get this to move for some reason here. Let's see. I'm not even seeing don't want to restart, which would be my normal solution to computer problems. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions, Hannah, to why this might be frozen like this? I seem to getting.
Okay. I
there-
am going to stick us on technical difficulties. That's okay. How about you restart real
Okay.
quick and we will work on getting you back up and running, okay?
Let's see. Yes. Let me. I think. See, now it seems to be working, but now it's doing that for. Yeah. Let me restart. Sorry about that. I'm not sure
Okay.
what it's
Click
doing.
through the sides. We'll be good.
Okay.
And I am sure that our attendees understand that there are technical glitches that happen.
Yeah, I'm very confused actually to why this is. Okay. So should I just log back into the Zoom meeting? Is that how that will work?
No, like go from the slide. I'm going to relinquish control and give it back to you.
Yeah, let's see if I can, wait 1 second, because I'm getting that spinning ball of death right now. So let's see what's happening.
You should be able to screen share right now.
Okay.
Just go back to the panel you were at.
Yeah, except that it's not, I'm not sure what's happening here. Yeah, I cannot get back to this thing. It's not letting me for some reason. I'm not sure why. Not actually ever had this happen before. All right, yeah, I'm not sure what to do here. This doesn't seem to be.
What if you close the PowerPoint and then restart it?
The problem is I can't even get to my cursor's not even appearing. That's the problem. I'm not able to get anywhere on it.
I would suggest that since we are this early in the presentation, log out, restart your computer, and come back. I will get you back in, okay?
Sorry about that.
We will make this work. Our apologies for the moment. What is it doing? Oh, great. Mhm. Mm. Wonderful.
Sorry about that.
Okay, John.
All right. So let's see if I can. So Hannah, you ready for me? There we go.
Go for you.
All right. Now let me see one thing.
John, are you screen sharing? Because
I
currently I
am.
can see neither yourself nor the presentation if you are.
Yes, well, that's the problem. Now this is my presentation now doesn't seem to be showing up. And I don't know why. Let's see. New share. All right. Yeah, so now when I go to screen share, Hannah, it's not allowing me to see my presentation. So I'm not sure what's going on now.
Uh,
Yeah, I don't know why this isn't showing up. Okay, let me try that. All right, did that work? Is it back up?
yes, we are back up.
Okay, my goodness. Okay, so can everyone hear me now? All right, okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Now if I can just get back to the presentation. Okay, well, you all saw this. We can, there'll be a quiz afterwards. So everyone make sure you know this material. Okay, so I believe we were just beginning to talk about globally invasive ants. Now that we got I guess I could make a joke about bugs being in the system here, but hopefully my computer will behave now. Okay. All right, so we were sort of mentioning, I was sort of mentioning about various invasive ant species, and sometimes my colleagues and I refer to this group of ants as sort of the globe-trotters. And so we're sort of talking about that these are the ants that are dispersed by people in a variety of ways. And one of those main ways, as I sort of mentioned, is getting around by traveling on things like cargo ships, but certainly ants and other organisms are getting around, of course, by things like air travel and all the different varieties of ways. So those really important globally invasive ants we're going to refer to as globe-trotters as we sort of go through in this presentation here. And one of the things that myself and my colleagues like to think about are some sort of big, broad questions about when we look at invasive ants. And one of the things, some of the questions we can ask are things such as how can we understand past invasions and sort of how an ant went from its native range to that new range and what that sort of looked like. Of course, one of the things we especially like to be able to do is try to think about how we might predict what species of ants might make the next good sort of global invader, if you will. So in other words, are there certain characteristics of different species that we can see that may make them particularly good at spreading around and becoming invasive? And then of course, what would follow with that is, can we prevent future invasions? So if we can sort of understand what makes something a particularly good invading species, are there things that we can then do to try to prevent those future invasions that we can talk about? So I thought that was sort of an appropriate graphic for Balticon here, right? Sort of looking into our crystal ball, can we imagine what groups of ants, what species of ants are going to be more prone to becoming global invaders that aren't at this time? And then if that's the case, what might we do to be able to prevent them from doing that? Now, I'm a systematic myrmecologist, which is just a fancy way of meaning that I look at evolutionary relationships of ants and I do things like describe new species. And this sort of idea of how what I do sort of intersects with invasive ants really centers around the idea of understanding the taxonomy of the ants. And part of this comes down to that one of the things that anybody who works with insects has a good appreciation for is that it's not always easy. In fact, it's oftentimes quite difficult to get accurate species level identifications completed. And this can become really important when you're dealing with something that may be an invasive species. So, you know, if you're a port identifier, you need to make a decision on, you know, $1 million shipment of apples or something from Chile. And you have to decide, well, is this thing infested with a species of ant? I see ants in there. Do I need to be worried that they're going to get into the country and cause problems, or is it okay? And so this idea of where taxonomy sort of interfaces with this can become critically important. And so this sort of brings us around to the so-called crazy ants, which belong to the genus Nylanderia. These are called crazy ants, by the way, in case you're wondering, really based on the way they move around. So when you sort of watch these ants move around, they move around in sort of erratic, quick sort of movements. This genus Nylanderia is actually basically a globally distributed genus of ants. There are about 123 current species. There's lots and lots of undescribed ones, including many which are sitting in my lab right now waiting for description. The only place they're not found natively is actually parts of most of Europe. But other than that, they basically have a global distribution. They're centers of diversity. And what I mean by that, where their species richness, the number of species sort of peaks, is really in the neotropics, so Central and South America and Southeast Asia. And one of the things that categorizes this genus is that the workers, the ants that you commonly see running around, are all worker ants. And much of ant taxonomy is based on the worker caste. In Nylanderia, the variation, the morphological variation between species can be very subtle, so it's not always easy to tell species apart. Nylanderia are found around here. For those of you here in the Baltimore area, if you step outside, right, wearing your mask appropriately, you step outside and sort of look around your garden or something, you very well likely will come across Nylanderia species. The one you're likely to come across is actually not a native species. It's one that's been introduced from Asia. But they're a very common group of ants around here. Here in North America, there are a number of different species. This is a species that I described a number of years ago. This is Nylanderia querna. It's found in the sort of central part of the country, sort of southern Illinois down into Mississippi. And we called it querna because it actually makes its nest inside rotten acorns. Here you see a part of one of the Nylanderia nest here. This is Nylanderia phantasma, which has a fantastic name, if I do say so myself. This is a species which is endemic to the Lake Wales Ridge region of central Florida, and where it lives in white sand regions. And so it's it's incredibly pale and is hard to see against the white grains of sand that it lives in. It's also a nocturnal species. So the way Nylanderia, these crazy ants, relate to this idea of invasive sort of globe-trotting species is that there are about 20 species of Nylanderia that have been recorded outside their native range. Now, not all of those become what quote unquote invasive, in the sense they may not be causing economic or ecological problems, at least that we can tell initially. So there are about 20 species in this genus that are found outside their native range. And there are about 15 of those which we could really call confirmed globe-trotters. In other words, that they regularly move around with human trade. And so on the right-hand side here of the slide are some of those 20 species that we see. This is from a paper from two of my colleagues that much of the data I'm going to present here, they've been working diligently to collect, Jason Williams and Andrea Lucky. So this is from a recent paper that they just came out, sort of looking at the different species that sort of get around. One of those invasive crazy ants, Nylanderia, that we can that has received a lot of focus recently is sometimes called the Tawny Crazy Ant. It was initially called the raspberry crazy ant, and this is a species that has spread all around the Gulf states of the United States. And here's sort of looking at a map showing you some of the distributions. This is actually a little bit of an old map at this point. It would be a little bit more filled in along those counties across the southern US. The Tawny Crazy Ant, Nylanderia fulva, is a really interesting species for a number of reasons. One is that it was in the US for about a decade before we actually knew what species it actually was, and that presents all sorts of difficulties for things like biocontrol and trying to understand where this species is from, and different behaviors that might differ from its native range to its current invaded range, all of those kinds of things. And this species is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it actually displaces fire ants. So where it's found, it often displaces fire ants. And you might think, well, that sounds like a great thing, except that these ants build up such enormous colony sizes comprised of tens of millions of individuals. They actually become a real nuisance to people where they're near. So in other words, they'll just get into people's houses, and there'll be literally tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of workers sometimes getting into people's houses. They have this tendency to get into electrical outlets. Ants do this in general. We don't really know why. They oftentimes will create nest in electrical outlets and cause problems with that. So this has sort of become a more recent invading species into the United States, this so-called the Tawny Crazy Ant. And I'll come back to this species in just a few minutes. So today I'm going to present some data really focused on sort of 6 particular Nylanderia species. And it so happens that these Nylanderia species can be grouped into sort of 3 categories. And these categories are these various invasive Nylanderia actually turn out to be each other's closest relatives. So for instance, the species Nylanderia fulva I just talked about, its closest relative is a species called Nylanderia pubens, which is also an invasive species. Both of these are from the neotropical region. Nylanderia fulva is almost certainly from sort of Central South America, probably from northern Argentina. Interestingly, it has the same sort of native home range as the red imported fire ant, which also occurs in this habitat naturally. We don't know where Nylanderia pubens is natively found at this point, but it is also an invasive Nylanderia that sort of gets around. Two of the other species I just sort of highlight here are a species called Steinheli and Guadalensis. Both of these are also neotropical, neither of which we know where they are from natively. But one thing we can say is both these species are found throughout Central and South America and get into the southern US as well. And then this second group of, third pair of species I want to talk about are going to be this species called Nylanderia barbonica and Nylanderia vega. Another group, this group is from the Indo-Malay Australian region of the world. These are likely each other's closest relatives as well, and also both represent species that we don't know where they're from. So, one of the big challenges when you have species that are widespread now because of human activities is actually finding where they're from originally can actually be difficult because, of course, if they've spread all around long before people were paying attention to any of these things, it can then be difficult to track backwards where they may be from. There are a variety of ways we can do that, and we've done that particularly with Nylanderia fulva, but it can be challenging. And you might say, like, well, why do we even care? Like, other than, an ant egghead like me wanting to know where these things are from, why do we really care? Well, one of the reasons is because if you want to do things like biocontrol, for instance, find parasitoids or other biological methods of controlling the pest species, going to its home range can be very important because oftentimes if you're going to find things like that, it's going to be found in the home range because none of these species, presumably in their home range, are sort of reaching invasive characteristics that we find outside of their home range. And so that can be a really important reason to be able to find where that species is originally from. Okay, so here we have these 6 various Nylanderia. I'll come back to these in a moment. So in thinking about crazy ants, we can really frame this in terms of 3 basic questions. And that's what I'm going to sort of go through with you this evening, is sort of 3 basic research questions. One is, what are the major clades and how do they relate to biogeography? So that's just a fancy way of saying, what are the big groups that we see within this genus of 100 plus species? What are the big groups and where are they found around the world? And how does that sort of relate to each other? And what might that tell us about the genus overall? Another research question we're going to go over is looking at the age of the genus and the biogeographic origins of Nylanderia. So in other words, how old is the group and where did it come from originally when we sort of think about where the genus originated? And the third question, which is showing up as number 5 for some reason, but it is supposed to be the third question, is we can talk about how many independent origins are there for globe-trotting lineages within Nylanderia. So in other words, this idea of invasiveness that I sort of started the presentation with, the question becomes, are all the invasive Nylanderia all closely related to each other, implying there might be some single origin of this invasiveness characteristic, whatever that may or may not be? And again, what that is not necessarily always entirely clear, but it might help us frame the question. Are they all sort of closely related, or have the invasive sort of globe-trotting characteristics of Nylanderia evolved multiple times within the genus? So that's sort of a big question. So I'm not going to go too much into the methods for our purposes tonight. And if anyone's particularly interested in how we do this, I'm happy to sort of go on and on about it. But let me just sort of say that, we right now within systematics, so within the field that looks at building evolutionary relationships of organisms, we really are in sort of a golden age. We sort of entered this new era of genomic sequencing, and it's totally changed how we do things, both in terms of the physical ways in which we sequence DNA. So this is actually getting those letters, right? Getting those letters of the DNA, the A, the G, the T, and the C's, getting those all sequenced. And it's also changed how much we can get of it. We focused on one specific group of genomics level data called ultra-conserved elements. That's what these UCE stands for in this slide. And we captured 2,500 UCE loci. And just to sort of put that in the context, that equates to about 2 million base pairs, so about 2 million of those A, C, Gs, and Ts that we sequence. And it's completely changed the amount of data that we can get now. When I think about when I first started in this field 20 years ago, the amounts of data we can get now are just unbelievable. And one of the things it can allow us to do is build a more robust understanding of how things are related. So I'm not going to say too much about this, except that we got these really interesting, what I think really interesting phylogenomics level data called ultra-conserved elements, and we used it to construct evolutionary trees of the Nylanderia to try to answer those three questions that I just showed you. And this is the phylogeny. These are the barcode phylogenies that everybody shows when we get into systematics presentations. I don't expect you to be able to see all those individual names that are found there. But what I'm going to sort of do is break this phylogeny down into a number of different component parts. One of those things is we found that there really were two major clades that we could talk about. One is what we're referring to here as the Indo-Malayan Holarctic clade. That's what's sort of being denoted by this number 1 box. And this, and that Indo-Malayan Holarctic clade is really centered around the Nearctic region. So that's here in North America. And the second major clade we found was basically all the other Nylanderia, sort of a near global group that included the species found within the Neotropics. So that's Central South America and the islands of the West Indies, and the Eastern Hemisphere. So all the rest of the world that we can sort of look at. And one of the things that we also found is if we take a look at where those globe-trotting lineages are. So remember that we talked about one of the important parts here was to look at how many times of that globe-trottingness, is that a word? Globe-trottingness of these Nylanderia, how many times has it evolved? And here you can see that from our phylogeny, this evolutionary relationships that we see here, it's evolved at least 5, it's found in at least 5 different lineages, and it's probably more than that. This is actually, it might look big, but it's actually a fairly small phylogeny of all the diversity out there. It's only about a third of all the Nylanderia known Nylanderia species diversity. So it's evolved at least 5 times. I want to go through each of those groups that I talked about, what I'll call complexes, just to sort of highlight a few interesting things. So you notice I showed you that Bourbonica vega sort of grouping, and here's showing a part of that phylogeny, sort of looking at that. And the reason I'm pointing this out, and the next two I'll show you as well, is a few things. One is you'll notice that there's all these things called Bourbonica, but you'll notice there's all these little branches that you see here, sort of branching off in lots of different lineages. What this probably means is that what we're currently calling Bourbonica is probably not one species. In fact, it probably represents several species that fall into morphologically into this thing we're calling Bourbonica. And it means that the species level taxonomy still needs a good deal of work. And again, the reason this becomes important, you might say, well, why does this sort of matter if we call all of these Bourbonica or we call them more than one species? It matters in part because, again, if we're trying to do things like control methods of an invasive species or trying to figure out where it came from, knowing which of these Bourbonica lineages is actually the invasive one, the globe-trotting one that we've been talking about, is very important. And we don't know that yet. But one of the things we can see is there's clearly a lot of genetic diversity found within that group. We find a similar thing in the Guadalensis and Fulva complexes, and I'll just sort of highlight each of those. This is the Steinheli and Guadalensis group. Again, if you look at all the names there, you'll notice there's lots of lineages, again, implying that they're probably more than one species that is currently recognized under those names. And I'm just sort of highlighting this to point out that, oftentimes we think about taxonomic names as sort of being frozen in place and that they don't change, but nothing could be further from the truth, particularly with insects, where we're talking about small things that oftentimes morphologically can be very difficult to tell apart. Here's the Nylanderia and Fulva, the Fulva and Pubens complex. This group, that species level taxonomy seems to be a little bit better, but probably needs some refining as well that we can sort of talk about. Just sort of in the interest of time, since I had my technical difficulties, I'll move on to the next thing. I want to talk a little bit about one of the next questions that we had, which is this idea of how old is the genus Nylanderia and where can we sort of look at its sort of biogeography. And this is just sort of giving you some of the specifications of how we look at this, but this is going to provide us dates and biogeographic, hypothesized biogeographic origins of the genus overall. The picture here on the right, by the way, this is a fossil Nylanderia. One of the cool things about ants overall is ants have a fantastic fossil record. I always sort of like to point out that there are actually more species of known species of fossil ants than there are of dinosaurs, for example. And one of the reasons that's really cool is because it provides us a way to look at diversity over time. It allows us to do things like this dating techniques to figure out how different groups are, and allows us to see how ants have changed over the last 100 million. Ants are about 100 million years old as a group, and so it allows us to take a look at that. This picture here on the right, by the way, as I said, this is a fossil Nylanderia. This is from Balticon, so this is a species that's about somewhere around 40 million years, existed 40 million years ago. Okay, so here we have that phylogeny again, and I'm just going to show in there some of the different dates and biogeographic origins. One of the things that our analysis showed is that the genus is probably somewhere around 40 million years old, and it almost certainly originated in the Indo-Malaya region. This isn't that surprising, actually, because the larger group that the crazy ants belong into also seems to have a lot of affinities with the Indo-Malayan region. And then just to sort of slap on some of those other dates, these are just some of the different regions. And so one of the things we can do with some of these dating techniques, and so I should sort of back up that the fossils are really important because it provides us minimum ages. And so then there's a variety of different programs that you can use to try to estimate how old particular groups are within the group that you're looking at. And this is sort of looking at those various groups. I'm going to focus on two of these regions, which is going to be the Neotropics and the Nearctic. Because this was sort of surprising. One of the things we thought is that, okay, so the group originated, you can see here our little ants with their explorer hats on, in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Malayan region. By the way, this is a map of the world from the Eocene. If you're noticing, it looks a little funny. This may be the future map based on climate change, but anyway, this is from the Eocene. So here we sort of see our ants from Southeast Asia. And one of the things that was interesting is that we expected that the Western Hemisphere would have been colonized sort of once from that. But in fact, what we found is actually that it was colonized twice. There was one group that made it into the Neotropics, so into South America, and that happened somewhere around 21 to 32 million years ago, as you can sort of see here. And then independently, another group arrived into the Nearctic, so here in North America, somewhere around 8 to 22 million years ago. So that was sort of a surprise, seeing that there were sort of two independent origins of the group in the Western Hemisphere that we can see here. So, what were some of the conclusions that we can draw? So, one of the things is that we found that there are two sort of major clades within Nylanderia. One is that Indo-Malayan Holarctic clade, sort of showing you a little map there of what that region sort of represents, and the other was the near global clade that we found that contained the neotropical parts of Nylanderia. So in other words, two separate invasions of the Western Hemisphere that we see here. The other thing, the conclusion that we can talk about is that the crazy ants appear to have an Indo-Malayan origin that happened during the Eocene, which is somewhere that the Eocene was between 35 and 45 million years ago. By the way, one of the things that I also work on are fossil ants, and the Eocene is a really important period of time for the evolution of ants in general. Basically, the modern ant fauna that we see originated around 35 to 45 million years ago. So it's a really interesting sort of period, and sort of it's not surprising that Nylanderia was in there right at that time, getting into the mix of what would eventually become the modern ant fauna that we see today. That Eocene is also the period of time that ants really became the ecologically dominant terrestrial animals that we see today was around that period. And then we can also answer how many times globe-trotting has evolved within the Nylanderia. And so we can say at least 5 times. And if you look back here, if you remember back to that phylogeny, it also was across the phylogeny that we saw globe-trotting sort of evolve. So in other words, it wasn't just in one clade, it seems to evolve across the phylogeny, again, implying that there's not sort of a single origin of quote unquote this invasiveness that we can talk about. Again, that sort of, it can be a squishy term, this idea of what makes something invasive or not. But certainly within Nylanderia, it seems to have evolved multiple times. One thing that could mean is when you sort of think about this idea of what species might we want to look out for, what might become good global invaders in the future. So it might become species of concern. It tells us that we really need to have a good understanding of the species across the genus, because many of those groups may have species that could become good globe-trotting and eventually invasive species from across the diversity of the genus, and it's not located in just one particular group. It would be nice if it was, but it doesn't seem to be the case. All right, so I'm going to finish up here and then leave some time. I see there have been some questions that folks have had, so I'm happy to answer some questions. I just want to acknowledge my two of my close collaborators and the folks who a lot of the work I just presented actually gathered that data. Jason Williams and Andrea Lucky, both of who are at the University of Florida. Jason's a PhD student at Florida, and Andrea Lucky is his PI. And so we just wanted to sort of acknowledge all the efforts they have made towards this. So with that in mind, I'm going to be happy to answer any questions that may come up. And you can see my information here too, my email. I'm always happy to answer email. I'm always happy to talk about ants, so I'm more than happy to do that. So with that in mind, I will be happy to answer any questions that folks may have. And I'll sort of pop up here, I guess, now. Okay. Okay. So if we sort of talk about which ants were originally local to Baltimore, well, there's actually quite a few ants that are local here. So to Maryland, there's about 120-ish so species that are, that's okay. I figured which ants you meant. There's about 120 some species native to Maryland alone. So here in Baltimore, you could easily, I mean, just in your, in a suburban house around here, you can easily find 20 species or so. So there's actually quite a few. Okay. So how did ants cross over 45 million years? I'm seeing that here. Not quite sure that what's meant by that question, but one of the things that I was sort of just pointing out is that it's around that Eocene period where most of the modern groups that we see today, that exist today, appear. So we begin to see those around that 45 million year sort of period. If that answers a question. Let's see. Let's see. So I'm seeing here ants are often portrayed as constantly warring between each other. You know, the famous ant biologist, Ed Wilson, he often likes to point out that if ants had nuclear weapons, the world would be destroyed within a day. And I think that's probably a good way to sort of put it, that they almost certainly would be. Yes, ant colonies, it depends on the species, but you know, even around here, many of you may see this from time to time. If you sort of step out the the pavement ant, which is actually also an invasive species, Tetramorium species that we see around here on pavements, on sidewalks and things like that. Oftentimes this time of year, you'll see that there'll be these giant battles between them. So yeah, the colonies oftentimes are competing with each other for resources and for space. And yeah, I mean, you can take that from what you may, right? People have made lots of analogies with ants and humans, but here we have two species competing for resources, and that oftentimes creates challenges between different groups, right? So yes, the contests are often between the members of the same species because they're going to be the things that are most likely competing for resources. But then, of course, there are lots of ants. You know, I'm sure most of you have heard of things like army ants and things like that. Most of those species actually actually eat other ant species. So the army ants, the main predator of most army ant species is actually other ants. So yeah, it just depends on the group. So there's lots of different things like that. Let's see. So so fire ants, yes. So fire ants are one of those things that, of course, that have become a big problem, particularly in the American South. And the question is, are they on their way to places like DC and maybe into Maryland? Perhaps. You know, one of the things that limits fire ants right now is it's a group that's very limited by weather conditions. They don't like it particularly cold, but obviously as the climate warms up and as we have milder winters over time, they may be able to gradually expand the range. I mean, they have expanded the range into southern Virginia, and they seem to be creeping slowly northward. Will they ever get this far north? It's hard to say. Much of that would just depend on how warm it gets over the next ensuing decades. But certainly as it gets more mild winters and things like that, we would expect to see them spread northward. Okay, so has anyone applied machine learning? Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's sort of outside my wheelhouse a bit when we sort of get into some of this. But yes, there are lots of different ways that people are applying things like machine learning to genomics data and how that can sort of be generated. It's not sort of my forte per se. I entered this business as a morphologist, and I've been dragged into doing all sorts of molecular data. Actually, it's very important and interesting stuff to have, but yeah, no, there's all sorts of, it's a whole area of systematics right now is within machine learning. There's actually machine learning right now, attempts out there to try to do species identification, right? If you sort of take a picture, get it up on the computer, can you use machine learning algorithms to identify the species properly? That's actually, there's some success with that, particularly with things that like dragonflies and things where you can actually have a two-dimensional structure like a wing and be able to use measurements and things like that. So yeah, there's certainly lots of efforts to apply this to genomics level data and things like that. And that's only going to increase, right? As I sort of said, I think one of the things that has amazed me over the course of my career is just how immensely different molecular biology has become over the last 20 years in terms of just how easy it is to get certain data and just the amounts of data that we can talk about. Okay, so how did these ants cross? Oh, I see. I'm sorry, the crossing over. How did they get to the Americas? That's a good question, right? So we estimated that those neotropical group arrived somewhere between 20, 30-ish million years ago. Sort of how did they get there? Of course, we don't know. It'd be great if we could time travel and take a look and see what exactly happened. But there are a number of ways you might hypothesize it could happen. Of course, one of the things to keep in mind is that the continents were actually a little bit closer together, not that much, but a little bit closer together in the Eocene. So that may have facilitated some of the ability to move between. You know, you could imagine that a rotten log with an ant colony, and it fell into the ocean and they happened to survive the journey over to the across the ocean, something like that. So we can do lots of speculation, but we don't know for sure, but it probably things like that. The other thing to keep in mind is that since the Eocene, there have been these periods of warm and cold that have happened that have opened up things like things like the Bering Land Bridge and things like that up in Alaska. It could be that species so for instance, that Nylanderia got into the Nearctic, into North America during a time like that. We just don't know for sure. Now you can sort of, when you sort of do a more deeper dive into some of this, you can start to see what species are the closest relatives to, say, species in the Americas. You can figure out where they are located. So for instance, and I don't know the answer to this yet, but if you were to look at sort of the neotropical species, are the neotropical species more closely related to a bunch of Afrotropical species or not? Things like that, that might get you into answering how exactly they've made some of these movements across. So here I mentioned the next question is sort of looking at some bees. Since some bees burrows, do these ants and bees interact? I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they do. If they do interact, it's probably almost always to the bees' detriment, because most of the bees that are going to be in the ground are going to be solitary nesting bees, and so they probably aren't going to do very well with the ants sort of around. So I'm sure there are all sorts of interactions that are going on there. I'm just not aware of what any of those may be directly. I have another question here. It says, do ants communicate only by pheromones, or do they use other forms of communications? So the short answer is yes, they definitely use other ways of communicating besides pheromones, although ants, more so than things like some bees and wasps, are going to be, in general, there are definitely exceptions, in general are going to be more prone to using things like pheromones versus, say, visual cues. Although there are ants that certainly do use things like visual cues. There's nothing known as elaborate as something like the way ants, or the way honeybees do their waggle dance and things like that. Nothing visually as elaborate that we've seen in ants. The other way that ants are going to communicate is tactily. So they're going to attenuate each other and things like that are also going to be ways that they could communicate. Okay, and I think I've answered everyone's questions. If anyone else has any other questions for me as we get, I guess, close to finishing up here. I seem to get on time, and I do apologize for the technical difficulties I have. Of course, that would happen just as I'm giving my talk, but I appreciate everyone coming out this evening and hearing me get a chance to talk about ants, one of my favorite things. Oh, and I'm getting a question if I'm going to Discord. I probably will not be, because I think I'm going to have to go on kid duty now that I've been off of kid duty for a while. It's going to be my turn.
Thank you everyone for attending this presentation. We do apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning of it. Thank you for, of course, joining us for Balticon 54. We do thank you. If you would like to, of course, come over to Discord and join us for additional chats, we will be available. There are a variety of rooms running right now. We hope to see you at additional panels during this convention and to see you for Balticon 55.